Hello and welcome to Deep In Pact, a proud member of the Duff Network where we dive deep into Wildbow's most work 5 years on. Coming up next is Elliot Diebold.
And that was Ruben Morehouse.
Thanks, Elliot. And we're here to talk about Null 9.6. And so Blake's back, and it's all going great. He's back in the real world. No, it's more out of the humanity draining fire and into the everything erasing oven, I guess.
Yeah, we sort of repeat exactly how the last chapter ended, with that sort of triumphant, I'm back, and then immediately it's all, is pulling himself together and he has to be completely surrounded. And you sort of get to relive that 2 seconds of like, yay, oh no.
Yeah, it gets you right back in the mood.
Yep.
Yeah, and we're back to all the kind of weird, unfathomable, gross imagery that comes along with we haven't heard the word sloughing in a long time, so, thank God we're back.
Yeah, considering Blake never even really looks at directly, it's amazing how visually fantastic these fights are.
Yeah.
I've pulled out one line from a bit later just to talk about here, where Blake's sort of in his little protective area, and then attacks him from above. And it says, a column of darkness fell right in the middle of the diagram. Meat and gnashing teeth spilling out like water.
Yeah.
And it's just so cool and nonsensical. It sort of makes me realize, in Rose Senior's little book excerpt in 7.x, she was talking about how, what we see as the results of demonic action aren't actually what they did. It's like the universe plugging the hole, right? So if someone gets turned to stone, it's actually more that they were obliterated, and stone was just the nearest thing for the spirits to be like, oh shit, put that there.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing here with I doubt is actually all this meat and flesh and stuff, but it's a living thing, and when it's inhabiting space, the spirits don't really know what to do, so they just
you just kind of see
random
there.
imagery of flesh and just being like, I don't know, and throwing it in. It's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting theory. It doesn't. I don't think it practically changes how Blake fights it, but it does explain its weird grossness.
Yeah. Well, and I think especially because when we saw it in the Drains last chapter, I don't think it was ever described as anything more than just darkness. And the spirits aren't really as active in the Drains.
Yeah,
so
makes sense.
In actuality, I think maybe it's darkness, and the spirits sort of manifest this as weird flesh monster, which is so cool.
Yeah. And at the start of this fight, I suppose, has a very kind of... It's very slow in an interesting way. It has this real vibe of Blake and kind of sizing each other up a bit before the fight really kicks off. Kind of animalistic stalemate, where as long as Blake stays still, is also just going to kind of stay still until things pop off.
I almost pictured it more like that bit in a fight scene where, if it's a one-on-one fight and there's a flash or something, and both people get kind of stunned, and there's sort of this race to get yourself back on both legs. They're both sort of coming. Blake is re-registering with what it's like to exist, and is kind of coming back from the light god, and they're in this almost race to recover to the point where they're ready to start fighting, and they're trying to take stock of their surroundings and where they're at. It's a slow but tense start to the fight.
Yeah. It gets you kind of primed for some of the more intense action that's going to happen later.
Yeah. And then, of course, Blake kind of takes a good chunk of this time where he's prepping to notice how, without all the loud sounds and the drains, which I'd actually forgotten about, as well as, the fact that the drains are so dark, he's finding it easier to see and hear. Even amongst all the earnest, just being back in the world. And I mean, he's now out of the drains and he's seeing and hearing more clearly. It's a metaphor.
Yeah, it's a metaphor. Yeah. Yeah, it seems like he's kind of, he's come back, I don't know, more awake in a few senses. I mean, this is an example, but later on he also kind of feels like he's, I don't know how to quite put my finger on it, just kind of more alert than he was before he went into the drains, and definitely than when he was in the drains.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, because it's Pact, the line between metaphor and reality is a blurry one.
Yeah.
But just the imagery of him coming out of the drains, and thanks to how dark and loud the drains were, he can now see and hear
Yeah.
more clearly, but despite not being fully functional. Like, that's, he's also thinking more clearly because he's more accepting of reality. Like, it's just,
Yeah.
it's good.
Yeah.
Um,
It's good.
there's also a little bit where Blake, he's aware of how massive is now. Like he describes her as very massive, and it reminded me of what Isadora was talking about in 7.x. Like, I'm wondering, like, is this some cool new other sense TM that he has?
Mm.
I don't know.
He can now kind of sense Ur's massiveness a bit more.
Yeah, like I don't know what to do with it, but it stood out to me as something where I was like, oh, is this hinting at something?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So Blake kind of looks around and sees the only small refuge is a little bit of crisscrossing light that's coming in through the windows. He kind of dives into that, and it gives him some very tentative protection from in which he can kind of scheme his way out.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a blatantly temporary position.
Yeah.
Like, at the very least, the sun is going to set in, like, what, a few hours tops?
Yeah.
And even before then, the pattern's going to get distorted pretty quickly. So it's very much this spot where it's like, okay, cool, now I've got, like, 5 more minutes before I die. What can I do?
Yeah, and I'd kind of forgotten, like, obviously a lot of the things in this story feel like Blake is on, walking the razor's edge with some of this stuff, right? But fighting like it reminds me, like, it's so fighting is so tentative. Any protection you have feels so flimsy, more than anything else. But yeah, this is like one of the shoddiest defenses that Blake has ever had.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he didn't have much choice this time, but if you stopped walking right into the middle of Ur's factory,
Yeah, true.
your position wouldn't be so tentative, Blake.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the thing that really stands out to me, we may as well talk about this now before we get into it, is the language of Blake's narration, I think, has noticeably changed compared to the previous fights. He feels less human. I don't know, that sounds like, it sounds like there's negative connotations when I say it like that, but like he's just like the word choices and the way things are phrased, it feels like less frantic. Like there's one line I've pulled out here where it says, and this is from A Fair Way Forward, where he's drawing some diagrams, and he says, lunged for me as I drew the 4th line. On a level, I'd expected it. On another level, I'd made the mistake of letting the shadow I cast give him an avenue for attack. I managed to pull my arm back inside the diamond, and didn't pursue. And like, I don't know, that was just a very, like, emotionless passage, I guess, for me. Like there's none of this, like, oh shit, like, panic. It's just, he's almost kind of analytical in the way he's like, oh, I have made a mistake.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't notice this until you pointed it out, but it is there. It's his. Yeah, I guess it's him kind of, I don't know, adapting his mindset to the other mindset of not worrying so much about your fucking meat suit.
Well, he talked a lot last chapter about how he felt less afraid.
Yeah.
And in this chapter, I really felt that. Like, he didn't feel as afraid.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing is, of course, Blake is back with the hyena sword, and it's back to its old half useful, half annoying self. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, literally, right? It very much, like, alternates between helpful and a hindrance, which is great. I don't know. It's such a dick of a sword.
Well, and there's something kind of poetic about, the hyena being his last thing that he's fighting with, considering, at least in my mind, they're still framed together and how they were introduced to the story. But I really love this bit where Blake is sort of holding the hyena and just sort of swinging wildly, and manages to grab it, and they enter this weird tug of war over the hyena. Cause, like, the whole time I was thinking, mate, just let it go. Like, fuck the hyena, honestly. Which, again, another example of why I would be dead and Blake is not, because the hyena turns out to be a pretty useful tool.
Yeah. And I'm kind of... it's interesting that he does hold on to it. Like, I guess he's desperate to hold on to any kind of tool that he has. But it feels like he's getting dragged out of the circle, right? It feels, I don't know. I'm with you. I definitely wouldn't have held on to it.
Yeah, yeah.
But the hyena proves to be pretty important to this fight. He kind of realizes that he can reflect light into through the reflective edge of the hyena, which is kind of surprisingly effective sometimes. Sometimes it actually doesn't work and just jumps into it and uses it to get a bit of an advantage. But Blake is kind of fighting back and then a cloud passes in front of the sun, meaning that the light forming his protective diagram is even less, even more temporary than we previously thought.
Yeah, which just sort of takes that feeling of, oh, we have an hour or so to, no, this is so flimsy. He's got minutes at best.
Yeah, it really advances the timeline, right?
Yeah.
So the other thing that keeps happening throughout this is Blake is taking more and more damage from and he kind of addresses this in the line where he says, I could feel my tattoos creeping in to replace the flesh that had been torn away. So it definitely just seems like Blake is like full on accepting, like, oh, we'll just let the spirits shore up my defenses and I'm sure it'll be fine. Like, I don't know, it feels like not a good long-term plan.
No, I mean, this is really Glamour 2.0. Sure, it keeps him in the fight now, but he's building up, sort of health debt. We'll see later how much this is already starting to affect him. But yeah, this is not something he can keep doing.
Yeah, and it kind of makes me feel like he has the mindset of like, not needing to plan for the long term, I guess, is a way of putting it.
Yeah, look, I mean, honestly, I'll give him a bit of a pass for the fight, because, you got to do what you got to do in those situations. But, like, this is very much something where, by the time he got to the apartment, I would have been freaking the fuck out and trying to figure out how to reverse it, whereas it doesn't seem to bother Blake as much as I feel like it should be.
Yeah. So Blake is kind of scoping out his surroundings, and he sees a broken window, and he realizes this is probably not a way out, but maybe it's a tool. He runs and grabs some like rock and glass from the bottom of this broken window and kind of makes a mad dash back into the circle, making it, although he kind of loses a few chunks of flesh in the meantime.
Yeah, I'd forgotten how much Blake always gets like literally torn up in these sorts of encounters.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, as we were just sort of saying, it's easier for him to shrug it off now because he's realized he's got that plan with Spirits Insurance.
Yeah.
But he's not doing much for his premium. That's quickly rising.
Yeah, I mean, do we even call that a plan? I don't know if I can call that a plan. I don't feel like it has enough, I don't know, planning to it. But yeah, so Blake kind of sets up these little glass shards as a way to reflect some light around. It's a pretty nice move. It kind of reminds me of Blake's apartment, which maybe is intentional because we do go back there later on. But I don't know, it's a cool little trick.
Yeah, I agree. As he started to do it, I was like, oh, neat. Like, building yourself little corridors of safety. There's also a bit of a sense of like feebleness to it though. It's like little shards of glass on the ground. Like it again, it feeds into this whole thing where Blake is hanging on by a thread for this entire fight.
Yeah.
But he just refuses to give up.
No. So he's bought himself some space with this glass trick, and he kind of continuing the thread of figuring out how to oppose he realizes that creation is probably the avenue to go down here. So he starts drawing pictures in the floor.
I mean, this is like the most Blake move ever. Like, you're fighting a giant demon of flesh bits and gnashing teeth, and you're going to draw it away.
Yeah,
like this is the kind of creative thinking that is why I wouldn't last long in this world. It's so cool. It's the sort of thing I don't think we'd ever see Rose do. Like it's such a bonkers thought. It could only come from Blake to just be like in this sort of situation, be like, I'm going to draw at it. Like that'll show him.
Yeah, but it works, right? And it's cool. It's a very cool moment of Blake making the connection to it being creation and not just light that is opposing which we kind of touched on with last chapter with the Lord of Light and Noise. But also as he's drawing these pictures, he's drawing his life and Rose's life, and it's kind of an interesting way to explore the similarities between them and the very slight differences. It kind of feels like he's accidentally forcing himself to be in her shoes a bit.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is obviously something that's on his mind. So it's not a huge surprise that, this is the first place his subconscious took him when he was looking for ideas of something to draw, is their shared history. But I also love how like primitive this feels. Like I don't know why, but for me this just reminded me of like cave painting or something, right? Like he's in this dark place and he's just drawing little things, and that's very like this invoked imagery of cave paintings and like early humanity. And I think that's a really interesting imagery to tie into the guy we just found out isn't really human.
And as if we needed any more hints that he wasn't really human, he thinks to himself, because his rocks are kind of crumbling as he draws, he thinks to himself, if I chewed off the flesh at the end of one finger, could I use the bone to scratch the floor? Which is a fucking psycho thing for a human being to think.
Yeah. Oh, wait, I read this and I was like, geez, Blake, okay, we get it, you're not human, but like, come on, bro. Like, what
and
are
he
you
ends
doing?
up not doing it, not because it's a bad idea or anything, of course.
Did it take too long?
Yeah, it would just take too long to chew through a finger. So I'll just rule that one out then. Back to the drawing board. Like, he doesn't even think to himself like, oh, that's an interestingly fucked up thing for me to think. It just kind of drops in there and he doesn't even comment on it.
Yeah.
Which is why.
But it would hurt. It would hurt so bad.
I mean, I guess
it's a terrible plan.
Yeah, no, I don't know. But yeah, his kind of draw my life challenge that he's doing here is having an effect. Is basically starting to act more and more restless and reckless. And it's pretty clear that these drawings are working, and Blake kind of becomes a bit more confident in the fact that he's had a pretty good idea here.
For sure. It feels like a bit of a turning point where you're actually like, oh, he's doing a thing. It's
he's
working.
Actually cracked it here. Yeah.
I also love the little detail of how the lines of the rose diagrams are a bit thicker than the ones of his. And he's just sort of like, oh, that's a bit weird. And it, of course, ties perfectly into that thing that like Mags and Sandra were doing.
Yeah.
Last arc, like it's just one of those nice little details that you just like, oh, that's so cool. Like, Wildbow thinks about so much of this stuff. It's insane.
Yeah. And so Blake is drawing and kind of he's gotten to the point where he's carved himself out a little safe spot. And in his head, he's kind of planning that he's going to be here for days drawing out pictures until has no space left to go and then, I guess, just pops out of existence, goes to wherever, things go when they pop out of existence, which I guess is the abyss. Okay, so obviously is bad and Blake kind of is fighting him and it's good, but it's kind of weird to me that Blake is going to spend days here doing this. Like, it kind of feels like he's getting a bit too close to the revenge monster style of mindset. I don't know. It doesn't bode well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like, we've already brought up a number, and there's probably more. Like, there's a lot of things going on in this chapter that sort of like all these hints that Blake is feeling less human on every level. And this same section you were just talking about, he starts to refer to himself as like a possible boogeyman from the drains.
Yeah.
So I think Arc 10 is going to be interesting because obviously like where this arc leaves things off, Arc 10 is presumably going to be, Blake trying to reconnect with his human friends and, he might have some things to confront because he's in these situations, he's just starting to toss away his humanity. And I think he's going to maybe have to figure out where he wants to draw the line there.
Yeah. I mean, he later on kind of points out that he doesn't think that he will pass as human anymore. So, and I think it's fair to say that's not just physically, it's like psychologically.
Having an insight into his head as we do, I would say yes.
So disappears in an attempt to trick Blake into leaving, basically, or maybe bargaining with him to kind of get him to leave, being like, no, you can go, I won't hurt you.
Yeah, no, it's the first one. It's like, I just don't believe it's the second one. It's the first one.
Either way, Blake doesn't go for it, so kind of forces his hand, chewing off a bunch of the roof in order to collapse rocks onto where Blake is in his safe spot.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a bold strategy considering what that would do for his, his space in the middle of the day.
Yeah, exactly. So it is like, it's a desperate move for right? Because Blake kind of calls it out later, what you just said. Like, during the day, there'll be a ton of light in here, and it basically means that has permanently, reduced his area to play in for the future. So it is working. Blake is achieving, but the rock falls down, the roof falls down on him, and he kind of has to make a run for the exit. But catches him, and they struggle with Blake kind of fighting against him, and eventually just giving into his primal creation urges and yelling, naming his victory over naming himself. And it seems to have enough of an effect. The spirits or something back Blake enough that he gets free and escapes, kind of vowing to spread the word about how to destroy now that he's figured it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty epic moment. Like, for me, it's sort of, it's up there with the one from just the very last chapter with the god and the drains. Like, there's this sense that he's running and he's just not quite going to make it, and he does all these little things just to help get the spirits to give him that little push over the edge, and there's that real sense of, like, they give him the nudge he needs to make it as far as he needs to.
Yeah, it is. It's good. I think I like the one from last chapter more, but this one is still very epic.
Yeah, like picturing him like sort of pushing through this web of, flesh and claws and limbs as he's like screaming about how he's like totally already won this and he's a boogeyman now. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. It's a nice moment, right? Like, opposing it with creation makes sense, and it's something that, kind of was on the periphery of knowledge, but hadn't really been put together until this chapter. And once that trick was exposed, it was relatively easy to defeat He just kind of drew some stuff. And that probably explains why is just a minor demon, but still seems pretty strong.
I mean, based on what we saw in 7.x, I'm like, I guess I haven't seen too many other demons to know for sure, but minor still seems like an undervaluation to me. Maybe he is sort of easily contained, but shit, man, if you can't surround him, you're in trouble. Like, once he's out of the factory, it's pretty rough. I mean, that's not going to be good. And I mean, so like, I love this bit after Blake gets out of the factory where he's lying there, and we basically just repeat the opening few paragraphs of the arc. Like, Blake wakes up and there's snow in his eyes and it's going down his cheek, like exactly like the rain did.
Yeah.
And it really completes this sense of like Blake has finished his rebirth.
Yeah.
Like, we saw him come back to life in our eyes at the start of the arc, and now we see this sort of, for want of a better word, spiritual equivalent of that. His rebirth is complete. He's made it and he's safe, and there's this. Ending the section with this really gives us that sense. It's so cool.
Yeah, it's definitely a good moment. And it kind of feels like we've come full circle, right? Last chapter he was backtracking through, the first chapter, and now he's kind of got all the way back to the beginning, and he's fully out.
Yeah.
So Blake has defeated as far as we can tell, and is back outside, and heads back to his apartment to kind of find out that it isn't his apartment anymore. Most of his stuff is there, but it isn't his.
Yeah. So first of all, obviously, like, Blake and us, I guess, are using a very loose definition of defeated
Sure. He figured out how to defeat at least.
He keeps talking about how he won, but it's more like he tactically retreated, I would say, at best.
Yeah, fair.
He made it out alive, so like, it's not nothing, but like, saying he won seems strong. But yeah, so obviously, as he said, he's made it to his apartment, and as I was just sort of talking about how the last segment ended on this whole like Blake's rebirth has happened now, we sort of immediately cut to a whole section that's dedicated to showing us that like this is Blake 2.0. He can't be Blake 1.0 again.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like we see the fallout from Blake's connections being severed, right? Obviously, we've seen his connections to people be severed, but he's given up aspects of his humanity, and therefore, this isn't his apartment anymore. And even more than that, his bike isn't there, and we don't really know what's happened to it. For all we know, his bike has fallen into the drains, right?
Oh no, not the bike.
Yeah. No, Green Eyes now has a cool bike to ride around on down there.
She's doing mad underwater motorbike stunts. I mean, for me, this segment isn't just about the fact that we're seeing what's happened to Blake's stuff because his connections have been severed, but it's also that he can't get them back. Like, it's not, this isn't that he goes back and he's like, oh, I can like try and, reclaim this stuff or get something similar. This is the closest thing we sort of get to that third trial in the future that I talked about feeling like we hadn't really seen. And this is sort of the conclusion Blake comes to, is that his trial for his future is basically that Drains is going to be on his back, making sure that he sticks to what he's learned.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's kind of permeated his life in a way that makes him think at least the Drains is watching me.
Exactly. So it's not just that these things have severed, it's that he's not even really allowed to try and get them back.
Yeah.
And that's what we learn here.
Yeah. Maybe the most tragic collateral damage here is his shirt has been drained. So now it's like a drained half shirt, like lost its color, lost its joy. So R.I.P. Blake's shirt, everyone's favorite character.
Yeah, it was going through its own shit in the drains. Like, it had all these visions of when it was a singlet. It was a whole thing.
Yeah, the shirt finally realized that its logo was backwards, and it realized, oh no, I'm a reflection of a shirt.
But yeah, and so obviously, I mean, something we've talked a bit about here, but obviously to match Blake's seemingly more inhuman decision-making processes, is he kind of looks like a monster now. Like, We already knew the tattoo situation was getting worse throughout the chapter, but now he sort of describes it, and it's like this is bad. Like, he looks more monstrous than like Midge and Corvidae. Like, he's not. He feels very other right now. He's not Blake the human, or the vestige that realized he's not quite human. He's like Blake the other.
Yeah, his broken eye has like tattoo branches growing around it and stuff.
When the birds are getting 3D there,
like,
it's 3D tattoos, which is just that's just straight up magic shit now. That's not passable as human stuff.
Yeah, it's he is now unable to pass for human, basically. And also he has a reflection, which is interesting. And well, let's talk about this when we get to the end of the chapter, because I do want to hash out the whole "is he in the real world or not" thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think that needs some turning over.
We'll get back to that in a little bit.
Yeah, but no, obviously, yeah. So, I mean, that's real. Well, that's really the end of this section. Is we've had this section dedicated to showing us that Blake can't have his old life back, and that culminates in him looking at the mirror and realizing he isn't his old self anymore physically. Which that's, of course, it's packed. It's happening on both levels.
Yeah.
I mean, you could even say that with all the drain stuff, right? Like, the drains will never leave him in terms of like the impact it's had on him. So physically now it's never going to leave him. Like, he tries to get clean and apparently he can't now.
Yeah.
So that'd be so.
Yeah, that's shit.
Like, that might be the worst thing that's happened in Pact so far.
So we jump forward. Maybe? I mean, well, here's something. Like, are we actually skipping forward in time, or is Blake just kind of now at the house? Does he like travel through the mirror? I don't know. Anyway, Blake's at the house now, is the short of it. And he's eavesdropping on Rose and the Cabal, kind of overhearing their conversation while he waits for the perfect time to reveal that he's back. And they're talking about Barbatorum. Rose is planning to deal with Barbatorum.
Yeah, and I just want to read a quote here as the others sort of, we come in mid-conversation, they sort of exposit that for us. And so Tiffany says, as in something like what was in that warehouse? And Rose responds, factory, not warehouse. And no,
Thanks,
not
Rose.
like that thing. The thing in the factory was a minor demon of the first choir and maybe on its way to becoming moderate. I don't know. The barber is in the middle tiers of the third choir, according to the books. And it's just like, so is she being a dickhead or a dumbass? Because, like, the answer to Tiffany's question is clearly yes. It's just like the thing in the warehouse. It's a demon. Like, you're splitting hairs. This is.
I mean,
a
that's
ridiculous
Rose's whole
response,
thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's it was a very Rose response, and it's just like sometimes I don't know if she's just trying to be difficult or if she's just an idiot.
So Elliot, Rose Jr. likes splitting hairs. Rose Sr. likes splitting airs. Anyway.
Well, now I hope that that's true just for that joke. Like, it's worth it now.
No, you're right. It really is an unimportant distinction there. But the thing that I like about this is, I almost called her Mirrors, but that's not appropriate anymore. Rose Jr., she's so keen to use Barbie, to use Barbatorum, and comparing that to back in Arc 1, when Blake was just kind of floating the idea of maybe talking to Barbatorum, and Rose was like, no way, no how. She's really flipped around on that, which kind of makes me think she didn't actually disagree, but this was just at the point where Blake and Rose would pick opposite sides of every fight just because they are designed to be opposing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think she more had issue with Blake potentially dealing with Barbatorum rather than, like, them dealing with Barbatorum.
Yeah, I mean, if she knew he was a vestige, right, it makes sense, but considering Barbatorum probably played a role.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you don't want the guy you're competing with reality holding to go and talk to the barber in that situation, for sure.
He might have accidentally broken himself up into 2 more heirs. Who knows who they would have been. But so Blake does reveal himself, and the group all kind of are horrified, except for Evan, who kind of steps forward. Blake reaches out, but only touches his side of the mirror.
Yeah, and so before we get into that, I really needed that little moment where Evan sensed something was right here on a little level.
Oh, thank God.
It's just, I needed it.
Yeah. Interestingly, Rose says the house spirit reacts to Blake being there, which is something pretty weird.
I mean, I think there was some stuff to do with, like, the house in that sort of vein in Rose Senior's interlude, like way back in Arc 1. Like, there was this sense that there was a bit more of a life to the house, and Rose Jr. just sort of so casually brings it up here. She's like, "Oh, the house spirit," and I was like, "But what's the house spirit though?"
Well, we kind of we've heard that parts of the house have been claimed as domains, right, by previous Thorburns. So it kind of makes sense to me that, like, through the process of that, the house kind of builds up its own spiritual presence that then has somehow gained some form of, like, light sentience or connections or something.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But like, I want the details, Rose. Like, come on.
Yeah. So Blake touches his side of the mirror. So let's talk about this. Is he in the Mirrorverse? Like, I'm kind of confused by this. Like, it's hard to tell, right? Because
the fight he definitely is now.
Yeah, sure. At the end, he definitely seems to be. The fight against theoretically could have happened in the Mirrorverse, because we know can go through reflections.
Well, I think the big thing here that makes me think that that's possible is there's that moment where he tries to shine the hyena into the darkest area, and it just hits this seemingly infinite darkness, and Blake assumes that that's doing something. Maybe that was our hint that he was in the mirrors the whole time.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we got the impression from Rose that it was very much like, where the edge of the mirror is, like, that's sort of where things end. So I don't really know what was he reflecting off while he was in the Mirrorverse. And he was using reflections so much in the Mirrorverse, like, that does my head in a bit.
Similarly, as I understood it, or at least as Rose explained it, which again could have been a lie, was that she could only be at the house or in reflections that were around Blake, which again doesn't really make sense for or for the apartment. Like, I don't know.
I mean, there was a bit in Conquest's contest where she actually was showing more ability to move around like that. But yeah, I mean, the assumption I'm working off of moving forward from here is that Blake, or other powered Blake, this is some new ability he sort of has, and maybe it's still limited to just the house or something. But I think he's kind of teleported here, in a very similar fashion to Rose, but he can maybe kind of do it at will.
Yeah.
Or maybe he can just visit the house in mirror form from anywhere, and then he sort of has to go back to his body in Toronto. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll see in a chapter. No, next chapter's an interlude, so we'll see maybe in 10. I don't know. Who knows what the format of this book is now? It's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, I'm assuming we'll find out in a chapter or in 2 chapters, but you never know.
That's the end of our show for today. Almost, because before we go, it's time to revisit answers to our discussion question, which was asking about historical figures who people suspected might have had a trip to the abyss and come back different somehow. So I want to call out one answer that I absolutely loved, which was from Brawl97, who talked about a Roman Emperor, Justin II, which seems like a very modern name for a Roman Emperor. I think Justinius is also what he was called. So he was he was, you know, an emperor kind of post the fall of the Roman Empire, I suppose. Um, uh, and he was kind of competent, hyper competent, to the extent that that the empire was being built back up again, until the Black Death came along, which sorry, Black Death. It's Black Death or the bubonic plague. No, would have been the Black Death. And it kind of messed up all his achievements, as well as taking out a lot of people, obviously, and taking away his kind of health and sanity. And so Brawl 97 supposes that that when this disease struck, that was the point at which he kind of entered the abyss. It's kind of easy to imagine diseases wiping out a lot of people and leading to some kind of abyss takeover stuff.
Yeah.
And then he really went off the deep end afterwards. I want to read out a quote from what Brawl 97 wrote here, where he said, "He reportedly heard voices and hid under his bed to escape them. He found servants who could competently play the organ in order to stave off the voices. Somewhat dubious sources say that he bit his servant if they didn't do this at precise intervals, and that he actually ate two of them alive at some point." Which sounds like the kind of thing that Blake would do now, which means that I like this. I like this theory. This is basically historical fan theories, and I'm all for
it. Yeah, the sudden voice hearing turned cannibalism does seem quite othery slash like crazy. So yeah, like I can see this. Like I like this, and I've never heard of Emperor Justin, so I really like how I learnt a bit of history and also a bit of fake history at the same time.
That's my favorite part of these discussion questions, just learning a bit of history and then warping it with some packed historical, I don't know, slash fiction. Another great answer was from Groby46578, who brought up Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great always seems to show up.
I know, right? He's such a practitioner.
He's very busy.
So Groby doesn't think that he doesn't have a specific point that he kind of slipped into the abyss, but definitely feels like it was early on in his life, because afterwards, according to Groby, his life seemed to be kind of defined by being really driven to avoid the abyss. So some examples of this are the fact that he named more than 70 cities Alexandria after himself in a kind of desperate connection-forming attempt. As well as the suspicious circumstances around his death, where he ate and drank a lot after a kind of victorious conquest, and just kept eating and drinking until he died. Like, even though he was kind of, according to his generals, like talking about, oh, I feel sick and stuff, but then just kept eating and drinking, apparently, which is very weird. And again, feels like it's some kind of weird shenanigans going on there, whether it's something supernatural causing this to happen, or him, taking his own life in a weird way to avoid something supernatural. Definitely feels odd.
Yeah, it's a bit weird.
Who
knows?
I like the idea of him naming 70 cities after himself in an attempt to avoid slipping back into the abyss, though. It's a very, practical guide to avoiding the abyss.
Do you think that makes him more resistant to something like or more delicious?
That's a good point. Maybe it does make you more delicious as an abyss target, and therefore it's a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, imagine doing to Blake what you did to Alexander the Great. Like, that would have been huge.
Yeah, I love.
Isidora's everywhere would have been very uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. Another one I liked by Kyrgyzstan was P.T. Barnum, kind of pointing out that P.T. Barnum was someone that was so adept at lying. And Kyrgyzstan wrote a little bit of a historical fanfic about P.T. Barnum never being believed when he told the truth, and so he traded away his ability to tell the truth in order to be believed when he lied. Which, I was looking into P.T. Barnum more, and it does feel very on point. Came from humble beginnings, and presumably got abyssed early on in his life, similar to Alexander. And then became very obsessed with, exploiting people, especially people who had, physical abnormalities, which feels pretty drainsy. I mean, we explicitly saw in the drains that everybody was losing their physical normalcy, and so I can easily see P.T. Barnum kind of getting accustomed to that and trying to, monetize that when he gets back.
Yeah, well, he maybe he came out of the drains with some sort of fascination or twisted sort of love for the drains.
Yeah.
And that was how he expressed it.
Yeah. Another thing about him though is he really seemed to have a lot of bad luck over his life. Like a lot of buildings that he set up burned down a lot of times. And maybe, the rational skeptic person would say, oh, like he worked a lot with fire because he was doing circuses and shows and stuff, which is, yeah, fine. But I kind of rather think of it as some kind of Abyss style thing following after him, causing bad luck throughout his life. I think that's a more fun read.
That sounds more plausible to me as well. Yeah, I'll buy it.
One final one I want to call out is Juanson, I guess. I'm not sure how to pronounce that one. Juanson. Johannes, yes, points out. I kind of was talking about, and I really like this. It wasn't talking about a specific person, but talking about kind of the Battle of Verdun, a war from World War One, or a battle from World War One, and how it was kind of horrific enough that it felt like it was basically barely a step removed from the Abyss, and there were probably people being pulled or bombed into the Abyss there. And then kind of connects this to the fact that 30 years later, a lot of Hitler's most zealous supporters in World War II were former soldiers who theoretically could have fought in the Battle of Verdun, kind of painting this narrative of like horrific acts of war, sending people to the Abyss, where they kind of lose aspects of their humanity and come back not whole, which I think is a very interesting thought. And I think the idea of war as a place for people to come into the Abyss makes a lot of sense to me.
For sure.
Groby mentioned the Vietnam War and the fact that, that was obviously pretty intense fighting and like thick jungle and stuff. It felt like exactly the kind of place where people would easily slip into the Abyss. I like the idea of war being, I don't know. I mean, we saw some of this with whose interlude was it? Eamon's interlude? Where he was talking a bit about the war from a practitioner perspective. And again, I just would love to see some Pact stuff set in the war, in a war. I don't know, like World War One, World War Two. I think that'd be so fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there'd be a lot to work with. There for sure. Yeah.
Anywho, those were some of the answers to our discussion question. Thanks everyone who left them. Those answers were left in our discussion threads, which is the place to go if you want to discuss the episode of Pact or the episode of Deep Impact that you have just that we've just checked out. The discussion thread for 9.6, this chapter will be linked down in the discussion in the episode description thingamajig.
Yep, and if that wasn't clear enough for you, you can also find all the information about Deep Impact you need and all the other shows on the Doof Network by heading to doofmedia.com.
Yes, one thing that was just posted, it was just a Mega Show Wednesday 2 days ago, which means that new episodes of a bunch of shows are out, including Media MD, our other show, where we were talking about the 2016 comic book adaptation of The Flintstones. One of the sharpest social satires around in and out of comics, according to Hollywood Reporter. So if you want to check that out, you can find the latest episode of Media MD on the website now.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely recommend checking that out. I can't imagine many people have heard of this unless I'm living in some sort of bubble. And it's definitely worth having a look at. These comics are weird.
Yeah, I'm really glad that I brought it to you. I'm very keen to get you into more weird comics in an attempt to bring you into the medium. This show and all of the other great shows on the Doof Media Network are patron-backed, which means that donations from our listeners is what helps keep these shows alive. If you'd like to become one of those delightful listeners, you can head on over to patreon.com/doofmedia.
Yes, and a little known fact about Wildbow is he's covered in tattoos of trees, and the only thing that keeps them at bay is his patron supporters. So head to patreon.com/wildbow to keep him intact and keep him writing.
Yeah. Otherwise he'll have to chew off one of his fingers and grind it down to bone, and then he'll not be able to type good.
What, so use that to type? I mean, well, I'd have to do all 10. Oh no, okay, moving on.
Got a bit gross there, I think. Something that's definitely not gross is the social media network Twitter. Not gross at all. And if you want to check out our Twitter, you can find us at @MediaMD Podcast.
Yeah, and so in a bit less than a day after this episode comes out, I'll be live reading at 9.x as we head to the end of Arc 9.
Yeah.
The Drains arc, I guess.
That's what they call it.
Or the first one. I don't know.
Oh yeah, Drains Arc 1, we call it. So thanks for joining us, folks. Our next episode will be an interlude 9.x, and that will be coming out on Monday the 12th of August. So we'll see you then.
See ya.
Bye.